some money to be able to survive. Joining us to help us understand how this can be achieved is the president of Kickstart International, Peter Juma Lugendo. Very welcome to Morning at NTV. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, sir. Thank you so much.
Great. As I spoke about this particular spectre of African farmers who are engaged in subsistence farming being unable to adopt to be able to beat the effects of climate change as we continue to see the revelations. Kickstart International is one of the organizations and sector players that are ensuring irrigation is adopted and better methods of agriculture are adopted by communities to ensure that we, well, transform ourselves into the kind of people that we want to be. But just bring us up to speed with the state of affairs when it comes to smallholder farmers, their ability to actually do sustainable farming, and where we are in terms of returns, because it matters.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much, the audience. So first of all, let me just give a bit of some story about sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
We know that majority of people in sub-Saharan Africa live in the rural areas. And in the rural areas, the only economic activity they can engage in is farming. So through farming, they are able to produce food for their families and also make some money from the produce.
That's
that they
right.
make. Unfortunately, statistics paint a very grim picture for sub-Saharan Africa. Globally, over about 20% of farmland is under irrigation, producing about 40% of the food that is consumed globally. And that tells you that irrigation plays a very key component in really driving food security. Whereas the rest of the globe is doing very well in terms of driving their food security through irrigation, Africa is still lagging behind. In India, over 50% of farmland is under irrigation. In Asia, we are talking about over 40%. And this is mostly driven by smallholder farmers. We are talking about over 70% of farmland in India and Asia is under smallholder farmers. The situation in sub-Saharan Africa is quite stark and disturbing. Under 5% of farmland in Africa is under irrigation. And most of this is concentrated in South Africa and Madagascar, and mostly being done by large-scale farmers. So we are saying if you look at individual countries, in some cases less than 2% or 3% of farmland is under irrigation. And no wonder we are facing constant challenges with hunger and starvation on the continent, because very little of the farmland in sub-Saharan in Africa is under irrigation. And now with the climate change, where rainfall is quite unpredictable, that's a situation that needs to change, because most of our farmers in the rural areas have been depending on the traditional ways of farming.
That's right.
Using archaic methods of farming, using very archaic tools, the horse and stuff like that, and mostly depending on rainfall for their farming activities. We are saying that needs to change, and especially with the advent of climate change, these farmers needed to transition from doing subsistence farming, purely depending on rainfall. We want them to shift to irrigated farming.
Before we understand how smallholder farmers can adopt and basically or rather take on measures that are sustainable in light of what climate change is doing in altering the rains and the seasons. Let's first look at the ability to be able to first and foremost engage in commercial agriculture,
right,
commercial farming,
right,
before we understand how we can mitigate climate change. Right. Where is the problem? There are so many interventions that have been going on across sub-Saharan Africa by individual countries, and there seems to be more like a stopgap approach. What kind of approach is best that fits the African condition in driving this kind of transformation of farming practices?
Thank you. So, and that's a very good point. Mostly our smallholder farmers in Africa are still engaging in subsistence farming, basically growing crops for subsistence.
Domestic consumption.
For domestic consumption. And the challenge with that, most of them are mostly doing very low value crops. We're talking about the legumes and the cereals.
Cereals, yeah.
So, which you really don't make a lot of money. And you don't do multiple harvests when you are engaging in that type of farming. And that's why we are facing challenges of hunger and income, both food and income security. How Africa can really shift and ensure improved livelihoods and income security for its people is to empower these farmers to move from subsistence farming to commercial farming. And how to do this, we want this farmer to start growing high-value crops.
What are these high-value crops? Because when you talk about domestic consumption, for example, on a daily basis, you need vegetables.
Right.
On a daily basis, you'll need these legumes and cereals.
Right.
When you ask a smallholder farmer down in districts like Butaleja to do more elaborate farming or commercial, so to speak, that brings in a lot more, it becomes confusing, because at the end of the day, this is what they want to consume on a daily. Now you want them to adopt high-value crops, which high-value crops may not be the ones that are consumed on a daily.
Actually, as a matter of fact, the high-value crops that we are talking about are the ones you just mentioned. We are talking about the fruits and the vegetables. So talking about things like cabbages, tomato, kales, the traditional food, vegetables like saga and the like. Yeah. These are the crops that farmers can make a lot of money. More so if they are grown using irrigation, because with the crops such as cereals, take the example of something like maize or corn, depending on where you come from. It will take you maybe between 5 to 6 months for you to harvest. Yeah. And for farmers who are depending on rainfall for their farming, what it means that they cultivate the land at the same time, they plant at the same time, and they harvest at the same time. And they go to the market at the same time. At the same time,
meaning there is a flood of products.
So there's flooding in the market, the forces of supply and demand come into effect.
Come into play.
And so these farmers don't make a lot of money from the produce they take into the market. And as a matter of fact, studies have shown that over 40% of the rain-fed harvests go into waste before it is eaten or even sold in the market. And that's the challenge of rain-fed farming. But with irrigated farming, when these farmers start growing the high-value crops, it means they are doing their harvest during the off-season, during the dry, hungry season. And at that time, the prices are very high because everybody else who is waiting for the next rain season. You are cultivating your crops and harvesting during that dry season when people are hungry. You will just be making money off your farm. So even market with irrigation is not a problem, because most of the time when you talk about increasing productivity, there is this question about where does the market come in? Where will these farmers get the market?
That's right.
But with irrigation, market has not been a problem because you are just going into the market at the right time when the demand is very high, because there's no competition, unlike when people are depending on rainfed farming. And so they make a lot of money.
Yeah.
And the beauty with these high-value crops, they have a very short gestation period. We are talking about an average of 90 days. So things like cabbages, sukuma wiki, the kunde, and all this. So within 90 days, you are able to harvest. Go to the market, sell, replant again. After 90 days, do the same. And so these farmers are assured of year-round income, and that is increases their income and livelihood.
Allow me ask the uncomfortable question, and it should help us to step away from the corporate offices of stakeholders and many people who are seeking this kind of intervention into the shoes of the farmer in the rural areas. They are seeking to transform themselves but don't have the liquid cash capital.
Right.
Why do I say that? There's a tendency for people to be told that at the end of the day, when you say capital, you're not actually understanding that the capital is right here in your head, but liquid cash capital, the logistical and operational aspects of commercial farming. Many are unable to do that because there isn't anything that is even near agricultural financing schemes. Don't you think agricultural financing schemes should first be rolled out in a way that fits the means and the realities of those farmers?
Absolutely. And one of the things we found out in our work, we've been in this business for over 30 years. One of the biggest impediments to smallholder farmers, especially the entrepreneurs, into getting into active commercial farming is the issue of capital. And so one of the things that we are doing in our partnership, we run a partnership model, is to identify partners, especially the microfinance institutions. And we have other development organizations out there that are working with the smallholder farmers and providing soft loans or a financing mechanism which allows farmers to acquire the equipment and then they can pay in installments. And the beauty of irrigation, and that's why we are so keen on these farmers transitioning from rain-fed farming to irrigated farming, irrigation also acts as a de-risker of these loans. Because with irrigation, as I said, when farmers are growing the high-value crops, they are assured of year-round income. And these are crops they are able to harvest within 90 days and replant and harvest within 90 days. And so these farmers, they even give the financing institution some level of comfort to extend the credit to them because they are assured the farmer is in a position to repay the loan. Unlike the farmer who is depending on rainfall, imagine if the rains fail, there's a risk to both the farmer and the finance institution. Because if the rains fail, the farmer loses their crop. And if they lose their crop, it means they don't have the money to pay interest. For the loan, And so irrigation becomes a very key component even when it comes to finance.
Allow me go specifically as we wind up this discussion on the different kinds of irrigation that farmers can adopt. We've seen President Yoweri Museveni teach the country drip irrigation, and many of these poor smallholder farmers, this is something you could rightly say is within their means, drip irrigation. What are the kinds that can be adopted depending on a farmer's ability, especially when it comes to capital or other logistical aspects?
So first of all, let me just talk about the type of irrigation that Kickstart International is trying to advocate for.
Very quickly, let's do that quickly.
So we develop simple to use, affordable, manually operated irrigation pumps. These are pumps that can draw water from any source, and there is plenty of water in sub-Saharan Africa. We're talking about things like ponds, rivers, flowing streams, hand-dug wells, and
even potholes.
Exactly. And so with our manual pumps, because we know in the rural areas we don't have the right infrastructure like electricity and even fuel. So with the manual pump, these farmers can draw water from any source and irrigate their crops.
That's
and once they start making money, they now have the capacity to transition to some of these complex irrigation tools like the ones you've mentioned, like drip irrigation, which is very complex because with the drip irrigation you need very clean water. You need an overhead tank. That's a very huge investment for a smallholder farmer. So you really want to provide that first step of the ladder where the farmer is able to make money. Once they make enough money, then they can transition to some of these complex irrigation systems like drip, like solar, like petrol, and even electric pumps.
All right. Mr. Peter Juma Lugendo, thank you very much for the insight and perspective on how smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa and Uganda, to be very specific, can adopt to the changing spectre of climate change to ensure that they do a harvest that is both sustainable but also brings in some returns in terms of money at the buckets. That will do it for the Kickstarter discussion, but do stay with us. Priscilla Regina Naloga will be returning with a lot more. Stay with us.